Welcome to Baithak. My name is Ariyaan Moktan, and this is my podcast. Now, I know what you must be thinking. Here comes another guy with yet another podcast, thinking he knows better than everyone else. And I do kind of have a reputation as someone who thinks he knows better than everyone else, but I assure you, that is not what this is. And that is the very reason why I named this podcast Baithak. Because what is a Baithak? Baithak is basically a group of like minded people, or maybe not so like minded people, discussing and debating things. And that is what I want this to be. I hope that through this podcast, we can have some discussions, some healthy discussions where we can reach a common ground. Now, of course, I do have some very strong beliefs, and you may have some very strong beliefs, but I hope that through this forum, we can reach a common ground by discussing and debating these things. Now, let's get into a little bit of the basics of what this podcast is going to be like, why I made the decisions as such. I already told you why I named the podcast Baithak, and let's talk about the language as well. I had quite a tough time deciding which language I wanted this podcast to be in, and I thought English was the best way to go. I did kind of think about doing this in Nepali or maybe doing it in Hindi, but I feel like I would always be alienating a group of people if I chose those languages. And English, I felt, would be the best way to go because that way I can reach everyone and, of course, have a focus on the youth because that is who this podcast is for. Now, what are we going to be discussing in Baithak? Firstly, I think community issues are going to be the focus of this podcast, and it is going to have a focus on my community, which is the Indian Gorkha community. But these issues are universal, and of course, they merit discussion in every community. Some of these issues are a loss in identity, a loss of culture, a loss of tradition, and I feel that the Indian Gorkha community is especially plagued by these issues. Now, to give you a slight and short rundown of why I think this issue arises, especially in our community, let me tell you the history of our community. We came from Nepal almost 200 years ago into this country as farmers and soldiers. We have been living in in this country ever since then, and generations of our families have been in this country. But we still have a little bit of a disconnect. We still have a sort of dichotomy in our identity. We still somehow identify ourselves with Nepal on one hand, but somehow still identify as Indian Gorkhas. Now, we ourselves are not sure exactly what we are. Some of us still have very strong roots in Nepal, and that ties us back to the country. And some of us have completely severed ourselves from Nepal and have created our own identity in India. Now, the Indian Gorkha community is quite extensive. It is not a monolith. There are a lot of tribes which together identify as the Indian Gorkha community. And I think that's what makes us beautiful because although we have separate traditions, separate cultures, separate religions, even separate looks, we still identify as one. And that unity in diversity is what makes us so unique and what makes us so wonderful and is what is missing, I feel, in today's day and age. That is what I want to fight for. Now, this dichotomy between Nepal and India has created a sort of tug of war within where in the middle lies our community. We still kind of feel attached to Nepal, but at the same time, Nepal has moved so far away that it almost feels like a separate community. Even our languages don't match. And that, I think, creates a sort of disconnect when we're trying to identify with Nepal anymore. At the same time, we don't have a separate identity to identify ourselves with, so we kind of always harken back to Nepal while thinking about our identity. And I think that is where the problem lies. Now, let us discuss a few solutions to this problem. I personally think that the best solution we can do at this point of time is to create the Indian Gorkha identity. And to create that identity, I think the first step we need to take is to start identifying ourselves not as Nepalis, but as Indian Gorkhas, because that is essentially what we are. We no longer belong to the country of Nepal, and our community has moved far ahead, or far away rather, from the Nepal community. So I think it is quite redundant to kind of identify ourselves back with Nepal. So calling ourselves Indian Gorkha, I feel, will be the first step towards creating that identity. The second step, I feel, which will kind of solve this issue, or at least help in creating the Indian Gorkha identity, is to create a separate language. I have written a small article on this as well, which my blog readers may have already read. But in that, I basically make the argument that the basis of identity for any community is their language. And as long as our language is still tied with Nepal, we cannot separate our identity from Nepal. Now, you may have noticed this, my fellow Indian Gorkha listeners, when you speak with someone in Nepal, although you are speaking the same language, it feels very different and it sounds very different. The way you speak it versus a person from Nepal speaking it is completely different. And that, I feel, qualifies as the basis for us creating a new dialect, or rather a new language. Now, the name of this language and how exactly it could be done is still up for discussion and still up for debate, but I think that will be a very good step. Now, we will go deeper in detail into these topics, but basically, this is what I want the framework of this podcast to be. There will be a lot of other things I will be discussing about as well. I am a little bit of a traditionalist, and I feel that our community has lost a lot of that. Three main things I feel are important are, of course, family, community, and religion. These three things, I feel, when a community loses, it spells disaster for that community. And I feel we have kind of lucked out on all three of them. Our family structures are crumbling apart, our community is lost, and the cultures and traditions, the rich cultures and traditions we come from, are sort of being forgotten. And religion is a completely different matter, which I don't really want to delve into right now, but we will be discussing this in further episodes. Now, the breakdown of family is my main focus. And there are a lot of factors which come into the breakdown of family. But I feel the main consequences of the breakdown of family can be seen in the most destructive elements in our community today. The rampant drug use, the rampant loss of culture, and the rampant loss of discipline in our community can be harkened back to the destruction of the family unit in our community. And that is something I really want to fight for. That is something which I feel is very close to home, especially for me. And I feel if we could make steps to solve that, we will be solving a lot of issues in our community. Now, of course, there are other issues as well. when we look at the community itself, there has been a sort of disappointment, which I feel is coming from a good place. Is coming not from exactly a good place, but a right place, which I feel as well. I personally feel as well. And the main reason for this disappointment in our community is the close to 100-year struggle we've had for Gorkhaland. Gorkhaland is an idea that we as a community have fought for and have been largely unsuccessful at. Gorkhaland was supposed to be a separate state where Indian Gorkhas could live and work towards the betterment of their own community. And the largely unsuccessful movement has left deep wounds in our identity, which I feel need to be addressed and which I feel have caused a little bit of a disappointment and a little bit of shying away from the cultures and traditions of our community. Now, when a community has firstly lost its roots, secondly is disappointed with what it currently has, it will still beggar for the need of identity and culture itself. So then, this coupled with the massive influx and massive success of social media and the internet today has created the perfect circumstances for our community to be highly influenced by Western ideology and Western culture. This is where I think the biggest problem lies. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that our community is so deeply influenced by Western ideologies and media, but where it's causing issues with our own community, with our own cultures, with our own traditions, that is where I think the problem lies. And it's not that we're learning the good things, It's not like the Western media is teaching us the good things about Western ideology. It's mostly the corrupted things, it's mostly the bad things which permeate into our community. Now, I don't want to get into details in the first very episode, but we will discuss about this in further episodes. Now, I think I have given you a lot to think about, and I think I've laid the foundations of what this podcast is going to be and what you can expect from this podcast. Of course, I do have a tendency to think I know better than everyone, but I myself am working on that. And trust me when I say this, I don't really have all the answers. I wish I did, but I don't really have all the answers. And that is why I have started this. Because I want us to sit down and at least discuss what the answers may be. Because we can see the problems, we can see the issues that plague us, we can see with our very own eyes all the horrible elements in our society. So the least we could do, even if we don't have the answers, is to sit down and maybe at least have a discussion about it. I thank you all for listening. I thank you all for watching. Until the next episode. Godspeed.